Okay, thank you very much, Senator. We are about to have a 30 minutes coffee break before we move into the last session of the day. They just told me that we collected 12,500 euros of the 35,000 that we are supposed to have for the scholarship. So I kindly ask you to move to the table at the coffee area just to make it bigger. Thank you very much. See you in 30 minutes. Okay, please take your seat. So we're about to start the last session of today's work. I think people on the stage does not need any introduction or presentation. I'm actually quite flattered to be the one who has introduced Francesco Sisci, who had the last person he interviewed is the Pope. So I suggest everyone shakes his hand to get some blessing. And then we have our president, Professor Mario Monti, and Francesco Giavazzi, that is full professor of Department of Economics of Bocconi University, and of course, editorialist for Corriere della Sera. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, to the organizer to have invited me to this very, very distinguished panel. I would like, of course, to thank Professor Monti, Professor Giavazzi, but also Professor Sironi, Professor Monti, and if I may also Dr. Minutolo, who shares with me a tribal origin in Calabria. And I'm very honored to be here and broach a very big subject. You know, we talked about macroeconomics, all the problems between Europe and China on the Silk Road, problems of management, investment, ports. And now I would say we broached the real macroeconomics, the big issues of Europe, Asia, and China. China has domestic, very pressing domestic reasons to start its new Silk Road, restart the new Silk Road. The new Silk Road needs to develop internal China, first of all. Of course, it's a projection to Central Asia and ultimately to Europe, but it's necessary because now about 70–80% of China's GDP is produced along the coast, where only 30% of the population lives. So there is a huge demographic pressure on the coast, and in a way, China needs a west coast to project its tension and its trade, but also its transportation, the flow of people to the west, to Central Asia, to Europe, through its land route. And for that, central China, home of 70% of the population, can hopefully have better access to service trade and commodities and develop as long as the rest of China. So it's a strategic project for China. And as a strategic project for China, it is meant to last for 20, 30 years. And will take us back to one issue which is very dear, I know, to Professor Monti, the ability to have long-term plans, which we in our democratic countries seem to miss recently. Is a project of a new development. And this project of new development, if it manages and develops well, it could project a new phase of development, even high speed development in China, and overcome all the possible hinders and hurdles that we had in the past months and a couple of years, I would say, in the Chinese development. This all hinges, however, also on a big monetary issue, the role of the renminbi and the international role of the renminbi. I personally remember a night in 1999 when we were walking, if I am allowed to say, with Professor Giavazzi and Professor Dorbush in Beijing. And Professor Giavazzi told me, what is going to be the future currency of Asia? At the time was the time when the euro was coming up, and it looked like America was going to have the dollar, Europe would have the euro. What about Asia? There would be a common currency between China and Japan. Would China and its yuan replace somehow the role of the yen and the role of the euro, especially because in 1999, China managed to weather the financial crisis and stem the tide of competitive devaluation that had almost toppled all the Asian economies. So it seemed that China could really be the rock of Asian economy. Honestly, then later, I had an occasion to interview then Prime Minister Zhu Rongji, and I asked him this question: what would be the future currency of Asia? And he said, very strongly, his character, certainly would be the renminbi. The renminbi will be the international currency in Asia. However, we have seen in the past few months the extreme volatility of the Chinese stock market, and that despite most optimistic hopes, still the renminbi is not fully convertible. So the question is now, and I would ask Professor Giavazzi about that, what could be the role of the renminbi in this situation? What could be the role of China with its renminbi in Asia and in the world, because it's a global currency already? Professor Giavazzi, if I may.
Thank you, Francesco. Francesco is very nice, but of course he's wrong in the sense that I did say in that night in '99 that Asia would eventually have its own currency, but I was simply repeating an argument that has been put forward about 10 years before by Bob Mandel, and is one of the reasons why the year after, in 2000, Bob Mandel, at the time a professor at Columbia University, got the Nobel Prize in economics. But it's very interesting to spend 5 minutes going through this story, because it's an example of the difference of the influence of the US and of Europe on China, and why in this particular case eventually the influence of Europe became more relevant than that of the United States. So Mandel was the first to identify this part of the world, East Asia, as a regional economic cluster. he was writing in the early 90s. And he was making the point that a regional economic cluster where trade relations develop needs a single invoicing currency. You cannot have a lot of trade if you don't have a currency in which your trade is invoiced. And Mandel is a man who sort of did his best work in the 60s at the time of the Bretton Woods system. So the model of Mandel is a model where the currency of this part of the world would be the Hong Kong dollar. So the Hong Kong dollar that at the time was linked to the US dollar would become the invoicing currency for this area. The renminbi would not develop. China would eventually use the Hong Kong dollar, and the financial center of this part of the world would become Hong Kong. So I went back to read his writing. That was his view of the world. It didn't happen this way. And instead, what China has decided to do, at least of my understanding, and what it's doing is something very different. It's following the experience of Germany, which had in becoming the pivot of the European monetary arrangements, followed a road that was very different from the road that Mandel was envisaging for China. So remember what happened. So Germany was also part of the Bretton Woods system in the 60s. For those who, beyond Mario and us and me, are young enough not to know what Bretton Woods system is a system where all currencies were linked to the dollar. It was born in Bretton Woods, this nice resort in the US in 1944, no? Yes, 44. So every currency was linked to the dollar with very small margins, plus or minus 2.5%. Of course, when the US started printing a lot of money to finance the war in Vietnam, Germany was not very happy to follow the monetary policy of the US. So there was a first reaction where the Deutschmark was revalued in 1969, and then eventually Germany left the system and the system collapsed. And then followed a period of intense volatility of exchange rates within Europe between 1971 and the end of the 70s that created a lot of problems for Europe, because European countries were already very integrated, but it's very difficult to have an integrated regional cluster if you have a lot of exchange rate volatility. Conducting business, if you don't know what the exchange rate will be when the invoice is paid, is very complicated. So throughout the 70s, European countries tried to get around this problem, and at the end of the 70s, they created a system that was essentially a system where currencies in various parts of Europe were linked to the Deutschmark with fixed but adjustable parities. The system lasted until the early 90s and eventually developed into what is now the single currency. And so Germany did not follow the Mandel view of using the dollar as the invoicing currency of Europe, lived through this period of volatility and eventually became the center of the center de facto. I mean, all these arrangements in the 70s were formally symmetric arrangements. De facto, they were Deutschmark-centered. Now, China is doing the same. So China has not followed the Mandel model of using the Hong Kong dollar as the invoicing currency. It has decided to use the renminbi as its invoicing currency. Now, to do this, there are a number of problems, because if you want the currency to become an international currency and an invoicing currency, you cannot have exchange control. This currency, the capital account must be open. And so what China is slowly doing now is opening up the capital account. Of course, when you come in a situation where a citizen cannot have foreign assets and you open up the capital account, you don't know what the effect will be on the exchange rate. But we lived through this. No? Mario will remember that at the end of the 80s, when we eliminated exchange controls in Italy, we were very worried. There were different views. A very important economist, who unfortunately is no longer with us, in Italy, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa was arguing that this would, if the lira opened up the capital account, the lira would strengthen as opposed to weaken. So there were different views, no? But we went into a period of volatility. So China is at this moment today, has to open up the capital account, which means free up the the currency exchange. Otherwise, it cannot become an invoicing country. And this opens up a period of volatility over which the currency will have to find its market value. And what I found interesting is that after the devaluation of August, 8 months ago, the currency now is not freely floating, but the mechanism through which the currency is fixed, linking the exchange rate today to the opening exchange rate today to the closing exchange rate yesterday, which is a market determined. It's a way to move towards the market. So it is not surprising that this creates a period of volatility, which is necessary for China to achieve what the Deutschmark has achieved in Europe, to become for the renminbi to become the center currency of this whole area. It will be the pivot currency certainly for this part, certainly China, Vietnam, or the way the issue will be, what the relation will be with this currency, and the yen, that we don't know. So if you look, I think that many people, especially in markets outside of China, don't really understand this. The big concern in markets is how large will be the devaluation of the renminbi in 2016. No? Some people are betting, some hedge funds in the US have put all their money on a 20% devaluation. I don't think that is going to happen, because the currency will go into a period of volatility, will move, will find an equilibrium, which may be below or above. We don't know what the equilibrium value will be, but it will be market-determined equilibrium. But certainly, the Chinese government itself has no incentive to engineer a devaluation, even if it wanted, for, I think, 2 reasons. First, because the impact on growth of a devaluation is becoming smaller and smaller. Now the estimate is that to have an effect on Chinese growth, which gets close but not up to 1% of GDP, you need a devaluation of 25%, which is huge. The movement we've seen are like 5%. Why is such a large devaluation? Because what matters now is not so much relative prices, but is your position in the value chain. Moving your strategic position in the international value chain is what really determines your competitiveness. The exchange rate is really secondary. So from this point of view, this was relevant 20 years ago. Now this is less relevant. Second, Chinese private non-financial companies have $1 trillion of dollar or euro denominated debt. So you devalue 20%, many of these companies go belly up. So this is another reason. Now, of course, you can tell me that the People's Bank of China has $3 trillion of reserves, but it's not automatic transferring these reserves to bail out this company. So I don't think there is an automatic, there is a reason why the government would want to engineer devaluation. We will have volatility because the government is allowing the currency to find its value in the market, which is the condition for the renminbi to become an international currency and become the invoicing currency of the area. This will take, the Deutschmark took 20 years to do this. No? The renminbi started maybe 5-6 years ago. It will take some time, but just to make a long story short, it's very deep. So Mandela had the right intuition and understanding 30 years ago that this would become an important regional cluster, was wrong, had an American biased view on what the currency would be.
Thank you. And before we go to the second round, maybe let me add some provocative remarks, although I'm attached to a very Chinese institution. Renmin University is the university of the party. Let me tell you, maybe food for discussion is that in those 20 years in which Germany moved to be the hub of of European currency and economy, it also was very peaceful, and it posed no threat to anybody. And China now is projecting its trade power, but also there are concerns, growing concerns, right or wrong, whatever they may be, of Chinese threats. So can China be the hub of trade and economic development in Asia while still having controversial relationship with some of these neighbors? And second, maybe it's also worth thinking that in the past 30, 40 years, Chinese development occurred by moving the development of China from the center, from inland, which was the center of Chinese development for 2,000 years, to the coast. Now we wanted, again, to shift back the center of gravity of economy in this country to the center, to Xi'an, which may be not too easy to achieve. So I would say from internal and domestic, from domestic and international, there are two problems. But a third problem, and then this I would offer the word to Professor Monti, is that the Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, however you want to call it, worked because somebody pushes but somebody pulls. And it worked for thousands of years because there was Europe and the Mediterranean, which was very interested in this trade with China, with the Indies. However, now there seems not to be such a great interest in Europe in trading directly with China, and maybe every single European countries are too little and too weak to trade with such a huge behemoth like China. Professor Monti, what do you think? What can Europe do?
First of all, I would like, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, to say a very special word of thanks, not only to those who have us here in this wonderful and most interesting setting, but to Francesco Giavazzi, because you should know that Francesco has given an unprecedented proof of loyalty to his and our university over the last 48 hours, because he is here, although he encountered some administrative obstacles in the course of his journey from Milan to Shanghai. In fact, he thought he was heading towards one belt, one road, and then he discovered that it was still one belt, one road, one visa. Thank you so much for being here today. I would like to try and answer your provocations, Mr. Chairman. First of all, by having a grain of salt thrown on all this impressive and ambitious initiative of the One Belt, One Road. It is really wonderful to contemplate, and one instinctively becomes advocate of its implementation. You will know better than I do what are nevertheless some geopolitical challenges surrounding this project, and I just mentioned 2 or 3 of them before turning to the European perspective on this project. Well, what is and what will be the attitude of those in Asia who feel a bit left aside by this project, in particular South Korea and Japan? And beyond that, what will be the attitude of which US president in less than a year? All that, will there be on the part of the US more a Pacific Ocean strategy or a Silk Road strategy? I think it would be great if you find a way to illuminate us on these non-European challenges around the project. And perhaps we should also mention a climate change factor here. Why? Because the more mankind succeeds against climate change, the less or the slower will be the defrosting of the North Pole region. And therefore, for once, there is a good incentive here, because if China goes on committing itself more than in the past to the fight against climate change, among other things, it will be able to preserve the great value of the asset One Belt, One Road, Silk Road, if it achieves it, because that would be very much undermined if too quick a defrosting of the northern pole and that region made traffic through the north end of the world more convenient relative to the Pacific, Indian, Mediterranean itinerary. If we look at One Belt, One Road with European eyes, I think we can find unsuspected analogies between this project and the European Union project, but also profound differences. Schematically, I see three unsuspected analogies. The key words being integrated economic area, steel, investment. Why integrated economic area is a powerful analogy between the two projects? Because if one reads the description, the official description and the real description of the One Belt, One Road, one reads the initiative calls for the integration of the region being Central Asia, Western Asia, Middle East, and Europe, into a cohesive economic area through building infrastructure and broadening trade. Well, this resembles very, very much a project that 60 or 70 years ago within Europe was developed to arrive at an integrated economic area, leveraging on what? Here there are some differences on the integration of markets, in the case of Europe, on institutions, not so much, unfortunately, in the case of Europe, on physical integration, the infrastructure dimension. And so Europe went more down the road of relying on the establishment of market economies. China is still fighting to get the status of the market economy. And Europe neglected maybe a bit too much the physical aspects of the single market infrastructure, whereas China wants to start from that and then see developing some sort of economic formalized integration as a derivative. Then one analogy that came into my mind listening to you when you said the real objective of this initiative is to develop central China. So that would be our periphery in the European Union, because economically it's now the periphery to the place of China where development grows. But in order to develop central China, it is felt by the Chinese authorities, correct me if I'm wrong, that they had to project an initiative beyond the borders of China and central China, hence Europe and the rest. Now, a bit this was done in the construction of the project of European integration. In fact, there was the instauration of the market economy, but also the regional policies, the cohesion policy, because it was felt that integration would not be sustainable if those in the periphery, the least developed, would not be helped to develop. And a bit like in the Chinese case in the making, Europe also felt that it was necessary to go beyond its borders. The policy of enlargement to the east is a testimony of that. And now Europe is beginning to pay a very huge price for not having done the same thing concerning what was beyond the southern periphery of Europe. And now we are even seeing the risk of European integration being in great peril because of the impact of the influx of refugees and migrants from parts of the world in which we have financially and politically invested much too little relative to what we did vis-à-vis the East. The steel, this is a small analogy but interesting, because in the description of the, maybe not the official description, but in some descriptions of the One Belt, One Road, one finds that one idea is also, or one purpose rather, is also to export China's production capacity in areas of overproduction, such as steel manufacturing. But this rings a bell, doesn't it? Because the whole of the European project started with the aim of putting together the production of coal and steel, because they had been the instruments of wars among Europeans. So this steel is recurring. And then, of course, investment is another analogy. And here, if one were to ask the perhaps naive question, what do Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, born in Luxembourg, and Mr. Xi Jinping, born in Beijing, have in common? Well, practically exactly the age. One was born in 53, the other one in 54. But now we confront each other, and potentially we complement each other, si parva licet, with the Juncker plan and the One Belt, One Road. And they have a lot in common, because both rely very much on investment. Investment being the economic aspect which links the present with the future. Both see a need for the respective areas to buy into the future through planning, in fact, through planning with different instruments, but through planning. But then one cannot avoid seeing also profound differences, and I believe I see in particular two differences which are not to the advantage of Europe. One is the role of public investment. I know that there are eminent colleagues and friends such as Francesco. You also are, but I don't know whether you hold this view as well, who say, well, be skeptical about public investment. It is mostly a vehicle for corruption, and we all know how largely that is true. Nevertheless, I believe that a number of measures have to be put in place, but yet alongside private investment and private-public partnership, also public investment when it comes really to planning and implementing the future of these economic areas is crucial. And here we are in Europe hindered a bit, unfortunately, I believe, by the fact that in the economic ideology of our dominant partner, Germany, by the way, which has not imposed ultimately its currency to the rest of the bloc because of the exceptional historic circumstance of reunification, so that we all, non-Germans, have begged Germany not to go on individually with its very powerful currency and to accept to share a new currency with us. But of course they asked that it should be on the template of the Deutsche Mark. But, and I think that through this a lot of badly needed fiscal discipline has been transposed into the rest of Europe. But I maintain, and in Europe we have some fights on this, that it is only in the German economic credo that any sort of debt is bad, any sort of public debt is bad, including the public debt issued to finance credible projects which, especially at these very low or negative levels of interest rates, which have a promise of an internal rate of return, and therefore a capacity to pay for themselves much higher than the cost of having the money. So Europe is doing a lot through the Juncker plan, but I think there is an asymmetry because the Juncker plan encourages and does a lot in terms of private and public investment at the EU level, but the form that we have in place concerning fiscal discipline is such that individual countries are discouraged from pursuing a bit more aggressive national public investment policies. And I think it would be in line with a world where the thirst for investment and infrastructural investment is evidenced also by the One Belt, One Road to be a bit more aggressive there. The other profound difference which I see not at our advantage is really the governance and politics, and you anticipated what is of greatest concern, at least to me, namely the time horizon over which policy and political decisions are made. And in all our Western-style democratic systems, which in many respects, I believe, are still preferable to the specific form of governance of China. Nevertheless, we are deteriorating the image of and the reality of our wonderful democratic systems more and more by having a degeneration of those systems into an excessive short-termism, as the financial markets a few years ago, and lack of orientation to the medium and long term. So that we are all living, and the US is not any better than our national systems in Europe, we are all living as if it were the exclusivity of long-term decisions to China, which makes ample use of that. And we are maybe overwhelmed by a sense of impotence in Europe because we see now a phenomenon of the national political processes devouring the European construction that they had created when they were allowed to have a longer-term perspective, which they used also to put in place the European construction. Should we be desperate in this comparison? I believe not. We should not feel humiliated, even considering and contemplating the One Belt, One Road, because first of all, extrapolation onto the long term of trends observed in the short and medium term are dangerous. Somebody spoke this morning of the moment when the Japanese had bought the Rockefeller Center. At that time, we were fearing that in a matter of years, they would become the owners of a large portion of the assets of the world. It has not happened. Equally for the oil dollars, they are too young to remember. By the way, you are very young, a bit less than me. You are not as old as I am. So we have monetary reminiscences in common. But in 1971, you were born, but you were still...
I was graduated in 1971.
Yes, and you had the idea, which you implemented brilliantly, of becoming an engineer. Yes. Hence, you followed the economy a bit more at distance. I think in 1971, one cannot neglect one decision that was not taken by Germany, but by the US, Nixon severing the link between gold and the dollar as one of the determinants. At any rate, we should not feel humiliated. Who knows where China will be in 2049, when we all know it intends to celebrate the first 100th anniversary of the communist revolution. I believe that we should already plan in Europe for the year after that, for the celebration of the first 100th anniversary of the European Revolution. I propose the month of May and the day 9, because on the 9th of May of 1950, there was the Schuman Declaration, which set in motion the whole of European integration by urging France, Germany, and the others to put together precisely coal and steel. And we had the capacity in Europe, look at those inspirational acts, to plan for the long term. Because our political systems were already democratic, but they were different from what they are now. There were no polls. And just imagine if that declaration had to be put to a referendum 5 years after the end of the war between France and Germany. Certainly it would never have seen the light. So I think we should still keep confidence in ourselves and resist the horrible temptation with which I will conclude, that if many of us were to be asked today, just tell me in one word what is your respective perception about China and the European Union, the temptation would be to respond confusion and confusion. We must resist this temptation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And, but let me just introduce, a few questions by speaking a little bit about the elephant in the room, that is United States. To the One Belt, One Road is also, in a way, a response to what is being perceived as a kind of encirclement strategy of the United States, which is maybe not pushing, but at least nudging on many neighboring countries with China on the East China Sea, Southeast China Sea, to pressure China on that road. And that reminds me of two important facts. That is, the rise of the mark as an important currency in Europe took place because America wanted Germany to boost its development, also as a testimony of the effectiveness of the capitalist system versus the non-capitalist planned economy of East Germany and the rest of Europe. So there was a strong support of the United States for the role of Deutschmark. And as Professor Monti said just before, there was a similar support for the euro in return for the expansion of the euro area. When euro was launched, the Americans were a little reluctant and skeptical, and they were afraid that this could at least dent the importance of the US dollars. And eventually, you correct me if I'm wrong, the Americans agreed in return for the expansion of the euro area, so that it is expanding. So all these changes, what I mean, these very important currency changes took place because the Americans' US dollar supported it. Now I wonder what would be the role and what would be this perception of the United States and United States dollar towards One Belt, One Road, which will expand naturally the scope of the renminbi. What will be also the role of Italy, because Italy has been said before, once upon a time was the goalpost or the starting point of the One Belt, One Road, but now it's been dragging its feet on that. May I first ask Professor Giavazzi and then maybe Professor Monti, who is the real, specialist, European specialist, has been.
So, only two observations on the new Silk Road. One, you mentioned the attitude of the US, but closer to China, there is one big country, India, which is not very happy about this project. India wants to develop itself as the core of this part of the world, and the relation will not be easy. But then I have two genuine questions about the One Belt, One Road project, because it seems to me, most likely I don't understand what the Chinese leadership has in mind, but it seems to me that they've taken decision without asking, do we have the comparative advantage to do it? So the idea is, if I understand, to try to develop, to rebalance China, developing this region in the center by opening up trade to the West. Now, it would be a normal way to develop the center. But there are two questions that comes up. You develop trade if you have a comparative advantage. What is the comparative advantage of central China? I certainly don't know, but it's a question for you. Is there something that is produced, can be a physical good, can be soft human capital that exists in central China that can be exported? Otherwise, the whole project doesn't. And second, when we have identified this comparative advantage, will this comparative advantage need railroads or roads? So the current project, the Silk Road, is in part overland, 2 or 3 routes overland, one through Pakistan and Iran, one for the north, and some routes over the Indian Ocean. But through these routes, you have to ship goods. Now, we heard this morning in a very interesting discussion about structural changes and innovation that the world is changing. Let me give you one interesting piece of innovation. Of information. We all know that there has been a sharp drop in world trade during the Great Recession of the past 6-7 years. So trade has collapsed. But if you try to explain the collapse in trade simply by the collapse in output that happened in 2008-9, there is a big unexplained term. So trade fell much more than what could be explained by the fall in output. And people who understand this, and if you're interested, there is a very nice paper by the McKinsey Global Institute that analyzes this. What is explained is that the structure of trade has changed. Technologies like 3D printers allow you to print hardware. In the GE, I read this on the McKinsey Global Study. The aviation department of GE now produces 5,000 components of a plane by printing them on the 3D computer. They plan to go to 20,000 in a few years. Now, if this is the world toward, that's one piece of information. The other piece of information is that 2015 has been the first year where if you sum up all of trade throughout the world and you divide trade between trade in services and trade in goods, for the first time, trade in services, the value added of trade in services exceeds the value added of trade in goods. So there are more exports of accounting services from companies in India to firms in the US, which is soft trade, than pieces of hardware shipped. Now, if this is the world we are going to, do you really need railroads, ships? Maybe by the time we build them, which will take 20 years, the world won't need them anymore. So I go back to what Mario was saying, that we have to look forward. I think there is a risk today of launching, in this case it would be China, into projects that take decades to realize, and then at the end, maybe they were not needed.
Professor Monti, what do you think of?
I don't have a serious answer, but first of all, maybe the profit and loss account constraint is perceived in a more flexible way by a political system like China. But I think in the long run, Francesco is perfectly right. If there is no economic return, it will not stand on its own feet. But I believe that their view of what is a justifiable hidden or transparent subsidy by the state is a view with a certain largesse relative to what we do, for example, in Europe. Then the argument is very interesting. In part, it compensates itself because you say, Francesco, that maybe those countries don't have goods to export, but then you yourself underline the declining importance of goods. Maybe being embraced in this area of mounting economic and political attention will help them develop skills, capabilities, investments, which will produce something different from traditional goods. The question remains, however, what will trains travel full of? Probably much greater, no, in the case of trains, not even people. So the question remains.
Yeah, let me add, before I would give the floor possibly for questions, to some elements. What is the comparative advantage of central China compared to coastal China? Land is cheap. Salaries are cheaper because salaries differ. There are not united system of salaries. So salaries in central China are much cheaper.
There are still the gabbie salariali.
Exactly. This is what. And of course, energy is cheaper because most of the coal and most of Chinese energy, 65 to 70% of energy comes from coal, is inland, and transportation system for goods is not efficient. So it's closer, energy would be cheaper. And lastly, I would say a boost there would boost overall consumption because if you bring industries there, development there, office there, then the salaries would go up and consumption, overall consumption would also move. And perhaps what kind of goods? Yes, I would say industrial goods maybe, they will be declining with 3D. But what we see in our developed countries is that there is an increase of trade for finished goods, bags, Gucci, but also wine, food, and these are all things that are being consumed more and more in China, and possibly they would be imported better, more efficiently, and cheaper, in a cheaper way from Europe in the long run. And plus people, you have 1.4 billion people. If they can move around and they can spend more going to Kazakhstan or wherever, they could bring development also to these areas. But these are, possibilities. Yes, please.
Could I ask you a question? I think none of us has spoken the word Russia.
Right.
We saw possible obstacles coming from almost everywhere else, from the US, India, etc. Is Russia so irrelevant in Chinese projections?
No, it's very relevant, very relevant. My perception is Russia has a very controversial issue with China, but in a nutshell, they would love to be European country. However, things in the Middle East, in Ukraine, have pushed Russia more towards China. However, despite the improvement of relationship, there has been no major, really significant breakthrough on the main issue, which is the building of a fast railway through Russia, which is very dear both to the Chinese and to the Germans. They are very keen on this. Why? Lots of problems, how much the investment the Chinese are supposed to give to Russia, should be 100% as the Russians claim, or should be 70-80% as the Chinese try to. Basically, the Russians are trying to sell even the land on which the railway will be built. So the Chinese think that if we are going to build such a railway, then at the end of the day we are just going to be blackmailed by the Russians. And the Russians are afraid that with the railway will come a huge flow of Chinese which will smother Russia. So because Siberia is thinly populated and there are hundreds of millions of Chinese just eager to move to the north. And there is a historical experience in the late 19th century. Manchuria, the 3 provinces of northern China, was the homeland reserved for the Manchu people, very thinly populated. And because of a famine in Shandong, the then ruling Manchu court allowed the Shandong people to move to Manchuria. Now the reality is that Manchurians have almost disappeared, practically disappeared from Manchuria, and there are 100 million Chinese living there. So the fear of the Russians that the railway will, in the long run, also bring out the invasion of Chinese. So that is very thorny. It's very, very delicate. It's a very delicate problem,
Thank you.
But, I shouldn't be saying this.
We learn something.
Yes.